Rubezahl, Lord of the Mountains, a powerful spirit also known as treasure keeper or guardian, dislikes all who dare trespass his realm, and above all, he loathes being called by the name Rubezahl. A countess and her escort that foolishly journey into his mountains will have a most unfortunate encounter with a headless apparition in bright moonlight. I'm Hannah, and I'll be telling you their story. A ghostly encounter. A rich countess once went with her 2 daughters, her maid, her coachman, and her servant Johann to Karlovy Vary, the famous spa also called Carlsbad, to spend a few relaxing days there. They traveled in a hurry and didn't stop at all, so they would get to their destination as soon as possible and have a great time there. At sunset they arrived in the legendary Giant Mountains, the well-known mountain range that is part of the Bohemian Massif. Now what you gotta know is that people, if they're smart, always try to avoid traveling through these mountains so as not to disturb, or worse, anger the Lord of the Mountains, the treasure keeper, a powerful spirit and shapeshifter, who is said to claim dominion over them. So the travelers decided to travel on in the starry moonlit night without taking a break, because it was such a beautiful and pleasant summer night, and they wanted to pass through the mountains quickly. The coach was comfortably arranged and slowly moved uphill. The monotonous, steady movement of the carriage gradually made the countess, her daughters, and the maid all fall asleep. Johann, however, who sat next to the coachman on the coach box, wasn't able to fall asleep at all, and he wouldn't have done so even if he could, for fear of all the strange stories that he had heard about Rubezahl, turnip counter, another name by which the mountain spirit was known. So he secretly cursed the countess's idea to travel to the realm of the dreaded Lord of the Mountains in this lonely night. He would much rather have stayed at home, where he had never heard of such great and powerful spirits. Again and again he looked around, and every time he heard a rustling or crackling, he flinched and trembled like an aspen leaf. More than once he asked the coachman if it was safe here, and was answered that he had nothing to fear. But even these reassuring words couldn't calm him down. And by rights, they shouldn't. His uncertainty quickly turned into naked fear when the coachman suddenly stopped the horses and gave a curse from between his teeth. Hardly 10 steps before them stood in the middle of the way an unusually large figure in a black coat with a white, shimmering collar. And you know what? This figure was headless. The terrible apparition always stood still when the coachman stopped the horses and walked on as soon as the coachman swung the whip to continue. "The Lord of the Mountains!" screamed Johann in great fear. And although his horror was boundless, Johann was careful not to pronounce the name Rubezahl, turnip counter, for he knew well that the mountain ghost hated this name. "Shut up," hissed the coachman. "Stay calm and don't look at him." But the horrified Johann couldn't stand it any longer on the coach box, and he knocked like mad on the window of the coach. The countess had this great idea to travel the Giant Mountains in the middle of the night. Now she should be able to give us advice on how to get out of this unfortunate situation, he thought to himself. Unwillingly, the countess came up from her gentle sleep and asked what was going on. "Countess, there's someone out there, and he is without head," stammered Johann, and he clattered his teeth so loudly that the daughters and the maid woke up. "And for that you're waking me up, simpleton, as if this is something you don't experience day in, day out back home." The countess laughed delightedly at her own joke, but her daughters didn't think it was funny at all. They suddenly remembered all those tales and stories about Rubezahl. Fearfully they whispered, "Please stop it, Mama. It's the mountain spirit. Have you forgotten? We're in the middle of the giant mountains." But the countess didn't really hold ghosts, spirits, and the like in high regard, as she shook her head and smiled indulgently at her daughter's fear and considered them foolish. She rolled her eyes and mocked the ghost stories, which she said were nothing but pure imagination befitting only imbeciles and half-wits. As she was making fun, however, she was suddenly interrupted when the headless black coat, who had disappeared in the bushes for only a moment, came into sight again, standing in plain moonlight. The countess's jaw dropped open, and her eyes nearly popped out of her head. She gave a loud scream of horror and hastily pulled the silk curtains in front of the windows. The headless apparition, however, didn't mind the countess and her daughters at all, but was intent on throwing Johann and the coachman off the coach. With blows from his fists lashing down on Johann and the coachman, he shouted, "Take this, and that, and this, and that, and here's another blow from Rubezahl, because you have so brazenly invaded my kingdom. Your coach, horses, and harness all belong to me now." The headless apparition swung itself onto the saddle and drove the horses at breakneck speed, so that the wheels rattled like thunder and the women's screams inside the coach couldn't be heard. All of a sudden, the weird party had increased by one more person. A horseman was riding next to the coach, and he didn't seem to notice at all that the black-coated man was missing a head. So he was riding next to the carriage as if he belonged to them. The headless apparition, however, who was obviously uncomfortable with the new arrival, steered the horses to the left, then in another direction, then to the right, trying to get rid of the mysterious stranger who kept following him. The black-coated phantom became nervous, and upon taking a closer look, he noticed that the stranger's white horse was actually missing a leg, which the horseman didn't seem to mind at all while amusedly riding along. By now, the phantom had become extremely anxious. "Oh dear," he whispered to himself in horror. "That's definitely not going to end well now that the Lord of the Mountains has joined us. It won't take long and everything will be over now that he's meddling with my game." The horseman now steered his three-legged steed very close to the headless phantom and asked him in a jolly manner, "Hey, fellow countryman with no head, where are you headed so fast?" With a trembling voice, the phantom replied, "Just following my nose." The horseman seized the horses by the reins and yelled, "Easy now, partner!" Grabbing the phantom by the neck, he lifted him up into the air and threw him to the ground with such force that all his bones cracked. The headless phantom, as it turned out, was made of flesh and blood after all, and he whimpered pathetically when the horseman tore away his mask. As the man now saw that he had fallen into the hands of the Lord of the Mountains, whom he had impersonated, he surrendered and began to wail and whine, "O mighty Lord of the giant mountains, forgive me. It was no more than a little prank." A thin smile appeared on the horseman's lips as he said, "I see it was a prank. Well, I'll demonstrate to you how funny I found it to be." He lifted up his mighty fist and was about to smash it down on the impersonator's head, but the latter cried, "Please don't. I'll gladly admit to having offended you, Lord. Please spare me, though. I beg you for forgiveness. I've done wrong." The horseman immediately halted his blow. The impostor's humble confession just saved his neck, for had he not admitted to his mistake, the horseman would have crushed him in one fell swoop. "Wretch, I'll get back to you later." With that, he lifted the terrified man, who by now was no longer headless and had a very sound head on top of his shoulders, with one hand, and tossed him on to the coach box. Then he pulled out his steed's missing leg from its very ribs. He smiled and approached the carriage door to appropriately introduce himself to the ladies. But the ladies lay unconscious in their cushions and gave no sign of life. So the horseman scooped fresh water from a trickling mountain spring and sprinkled it into the ladies' faces, bringing them back to life. As soon as they saw the handsome horseman, they were delighted and happy to enjoy his kind protection. He introduced himself and said, "I am so sorry you had to endure the evil schemes of a villain who had the intention of robbing you of your possessions. I'm honored to humbly offer you my protection, ladies. Please allow me to introduce myself. I am the Colonel of Rubezahl, and I'd be happy to escort you to my country estate, which is in fact very close by." The countess and her daughters gladly accepted the friendly offer and followed the so-called colonel to his estate. And while they were merrily discussing their good fate of having met such a gentleman, the impostor, who was driving the coach, saw to his horror how the horseman caught a number of bats with his bare hands, whispered something into their ears, and then released them again. What that was about, what happened to the ladies, and what happened to the terrified impostor, well, that's a completely different story. When did you first suspect that the headless apparition was in fact not Rubezahl, Lord of the Mountains? Tell me by leaving a comment below. Always stay updated for my new stories. Subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon. And if you enjoyed the story, give it a like.